Good evening. I am Susan Lance, Vice President for Student Life. Susquehanna University wants all community members to feel welcome and safe in an environment dedicated to the critical discussion of complex and challenging ideas. With safety in mind, we created precautions around this evening's event. Thank you all for your patience and understanding with the security surrounding the ticketing process and entrance into the theater. Our faculty handbook policy on guest speakers highlights the importance of open inquiry and free discussion as necessary provisions for freedom to learn and for educational development. The policy also states that any speaker who is a guest of the university is entitled to a courteous hearing regardless of the position advocated. To all audience members, thank you in advance for your respectful hospitality toward tonight's speaker. I also want to take this time to thank the Susquehanna faculty and staff members standing both inside and outside the theater, identified by their Susquehanna gear and official name tags, serving as community liaisons this evening. Their role is to help ensure that all are able to listen and view tonight's presentation without distraction. I want to remind everyone in the audience that this presentation is being live streamed by Susquehanna. If you plan on asking questions this evening, your voice and your question will be part of that broadcast. Before I turn the evening over to our college Republicans who have organized tonight's presentation, I ask you silence your cell phones and continue to act in a manner consistent with our academic mission. I appreciate your respectful participation in this discourse on free speech. And now I turn this evening over to the college Republicans.
Good evening. My name is Keith Gaiman. I'm the Vice President of the Susquehanna University College Republicans. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you all for coming. On behalf of our organization, I'd like to take a few moments to thank some of the people who are essential to making this event happen. Firstly, we'd like to thank the university, especially the Office of the President, the Office of Student Life, the Office of Event Management, and the Department of Public Safety for helping us to plan and organize the event. We'd also like to thank the Student Government Association for their support. Lastly, we'd like to thank the Young America's Foundation for their generosity in helping this event to happen. And now I'd like to introduce our president, Jonah Winokur.
Good evening. My name is Jonah Winokur, and I'm the president of the Susquehanna University College Republicans. I would like to welcome my fellow students, our faculty and staff, and community members, and I'm so glad that you all could make it out tonight. Our organization works to bring political discourse to this campus in a number of ways and to be a voice for conservative students. We want to make this campus a place where ideas can flow freely, and tonight we hope to further that goal. We are honored to bring to campus a man who is instrumental in my own political upbringing and has paved the way for so many young conservatives. Our guest speaker tonight is a graduate of UCLA and Harvard Law. He is also a New York Times bestselling author and the editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire. And he hosts the top conservative podcast in the nation, The Ben Shapiro Show. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to Susquehanna, Mr. Ben Shapiro. Well, thanks so much for having me here tonight at Susquehanna. First, I want to thank the university for having me. I want to thank law enforcement for protecting these events, as always. I want to thank Young America's Foundation and the College Republicans for making the event happen. And I want to thank the College Democrats who apparently co-sponsored the event, which is awesome. I heard that some of the leaders of the College Democrats are also protesting the event, which is
a bold strategy to both sponsor the event and protest it, but no one ever said that Democrats were good at logic. Now, I heard that there was a group called Susquehanna Rising, which apparently failed to rise, because they were supposedly going to shut down this event. That clearly didn't happen. According to them, I'm a racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe, anti-Semite, which is weird. They could show up and ask questions. I have a standing rule. We will do Q&A, which is always the most fun part, and the standing rule is always that if you disagree with me, you raise your hand, you go to the front of the line, and then we can have a nice discussion, which is always the part that I most enjoy. Instead, a lot of them chose to protest, or at least a couple of them did, fair weather protesters. It's very cold outside, to be fair. But there was one letter that really struck me. So there was an open letter from a student named Nolan Nightingale. I don't want to pick on him, but he did write me an open letter, so I feel obliged to respond. He's a student here. And here is what he wrote. He wrote, "Dear Mr. Shapiro, I am a student at Susquehanna University and a proud one at that. If that name sounds familiar to you, it's because you're scheduled to speak here March 20th of this year. You were invited by the Young Republicans group, a group of people who are by all means reasonable and relatively nice." So congratulations, guys. He says, "I've grown up around Republicans all my life. My parents, whom I love very much, are Republicans. There's nothing wrong with level-headed Republicans. A large amount of the people coming to see you speak are not level-headed Republicans. So I guess some of you are apparently horrifying terrorists." He says, "The people I am about to describe should be the kind of scum that gets you riled up when you hear that they dare to claim to belong to the same group as you. Of course, you do not denounce these people, at least publicly, because they are your bread and butter." So he's about to talk about how terrible all you people are. So let's hear what he has to say. He says, "Your fan base are people who have sent death threats to the faculty of my school simply because we ran out of tickets for them to see you. Well, I'm not afraid to condemn that. That's horrible, but I haven't heard any of that. I mean, if that's happened, then I hope that those people are prosecuted because that's illegal. You're not allowed to make death threats against people." And he said, "Your fan base are the people that are making my friends lock themselves in their rooms on the day that you're here for fear of their lives." What do you guys do here for fun? "Your fan base are the same people who went through this campus last year scrawling F would be a curse word for gay people, free world on the sidewalk, and drawing swastikas on everything they see." Yes, I'm sure that my fans are the people drawing swastikas. Yeah, I'm sure that's my crowd, exactly, the swastika folks. In 2016, I was literally the #1 recipient of anti-Semitism in the Jewish journalistic community from the alt-right. 40% of all anti-Semitic tweets directed at journalists in the entire year 2016 were directed to me personally. I'm sure that everyone who's scrawling swastika, they're all my fans. They love me. And then he says, "But hey, how many fans of Milo Yiannopoulos do you think are also big fans of any gay people they meet in real life?" I've made clear that I'm not a fan of Milo Yiannopoulos. He says, "This is not to say that you're responsible for the actions of your fans." Okay. He says, "This is not even to say that these people represent all of your fans. Hell, my little brother's a huge fan of yours, and he's far from those monsters I just described," which is good. Maybe you should listen to your little brother. He sounds smarter. He says, "This is, however, to call to attention the fact that if those people are the ones supporting the beliefs you espouse, maybe it's time to reevaluate those beliefs." So in other words, if there are some really awful people who I've never heard of and I'm happy to condemn, doing terrible things, but they listen to my show, then maybe it's because my belief system is driving them to do all of these things. Now, this author doesn't provide any evidence of this, no evidence that these people are being driven by my particular political viewpoint to go and do vile things. And he's providing no evidence because that evidence doesn't exist, right? That evidence is not there. Plus, there's a basic failure of logic here. And when a Bernie Sanders supporter went and shot up a congressional baseball game, I said, this is not Bernie Sanders' fault. Right? Bernie Sanders didn't tell anybody to go shoot up a congressional baseball game. Well, I've never said that anybody should engage in violence. I've never said that anybody should engage in vulgarity. I've never said that anybody should engage in anything untoward. And yet, somehow, if people who follow me do these things, then it is an indicator that I have a lack of moral soul. And this is the central issue of our time. Not mean letters against me, although it is dear to my heart. But the larger issue, which is that too many people in our politics, and this is true of people on the left and also some people on the right, are more interested in casting aspersions on the character of people with whom they disagree than they are in actually making reasoned, rational arguments. Because that's what this screed is. All this screed is, I don't like you, you're a bad person, wah, wah, wah. Well, too bad, I'm here and I'm gonna make arguments, because that's my job. And it's your job too. In a republic, a free and open republic, it is your job to engage in conversations that you may not like. It is your job to engage with ideas that may challenge you. These are the things that you are supposed to do. These are the bases of the First Amendment. These are the bases of American freedom. But the way to avoid that trap for a lot of folks on the left is to suggest that we don't have to have these conversations because I'm just too much of a terrible person in order to have those conversations. And this mindset, unfortunately, has now run roughshod over large swaths of the politically correct left on a wide variety of issues. On gun control, we see this pop up. If you're not in favor of a gun control agenda, therefore you must not care enough about dead children in Parkland or in Sandy Hook. It was disgusting when Piers Morgan said it in 2013. It's disgusting now. Everyone who believes in gun rights in the United States, unless you can prove that they are a criminal who wants to murder children, cares about children being killed. It's one of the reasons we're in favor of gun rights. There was a shooting today in Maryland that was stopped by an armed guard. Okay, we want more armed guards. We may disagree on the strategy for stopping school shootings, but this does not mean I don't care about dead children. On the contrary, it means I think your solution to preventing dead children is wrong. And that's why we're having this discussion in the first place. But we can't have the discussion so long as you're accusing me of not caring about dead kids. Or racial issues, right? There are racial disparities in income. There are racial disparities in wealth. And we can talk about the ways for those racial disparities to be cured. We can talk about how we get to a more free and open society. Or you can just call me a racist because I don't agree with your affirmative action program. Or you can call me a racist because I don't think it's useful for you to shout white privilege at the moon. Right? You can say whatever you want about me as a character, and that prevents you from actually having to make a decent argument. Right? All you have to do is just shout that I'm a member of the white privileged class, I'm a white male, and therefore my opinion means nothing. All you have to do is fall back on an intersectional philosophy that substitutes identity for decent argumentation. Right? The idea of intersectionality, which now predominates on the left, is the idea that we can almost rank people's viewpoints and the value of those viewpoints by who they are as human beings, and not who they are individually in terms of their beliefs, but who they are individually in terms of their group membership. So the idea is that we all have these interlocking experiences, right? I'm a white man, but I'm also Jewish, and this gives me a different experience than a white man who's not a Jewish man. And if I'm a black female, I have two different experiences, female and black, and these are interlocked, and this defines me as a human being. Or maybe what defines you as a human being is that you're an individual human being with thoughts, feelings, desires, wants, wishes, and arguments. Maybe that's what defines you as a human being. And maybe all of your experiences have impacted that, but your experiences are not you, because not every black woman has the same experience. There are black women in this audience who have not had the same experience as Condoleezza Rice. There are white men in this audience who have not had the same experiences as Ted Bundy. Okay, there are lots of people all across the United States who have different experiences, and grouping them by population is an element of racism, but more importantly what it is, it's an attempt to quash debate. It's an attempt to say that if you are not in the upper echelon of victimhood, then therefore your opinion means less, because you just can't understand each other. And this is eating away at the heart of our democracy. If I can't understand you because you're a black woman, if the idea is that you're a black woman, I can never have your experience, therefore I can't understand you, how are we supposed to come to agreement about public policy? How are we supposed to even have a discussion with one another? I'm not a child, right? My children are children, but I can understand their experiences well enough to come to some sort of agreement about what they're going to do. Usually it involves me just telling them what to do. When I have a discussion with my wife is a female. Okay, my wife happens to be a very intelligent human being. Will I ever know what it's like to carry a child in my womb? No. Does that mean that we can't have a decent conversation about how much we should spend on the groceries? Of course not. That's silly. Or even about abortion. Should we have a decent conversation about? Yes, we can have these conversations because we have the capacity to use the things inside our head called brains rather than the stuff in our skin called melanin. This is the entire Bernie Sanders shtick also. Yesterday, I think last night, they had some sort of ridiculous town hall on inequality held by Michael Moore, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and some rando professor that nobody'd ever heard of before that night. I can't remember where he teaches. He's a New School economist, I believe. Number one, it's always weird to hold a town hall event on income inequality when three of the people on stage are worth a combined $61 million and own 13 homes. But beyond that, the idea there was that, again, if you disagree with Bernie Sanders on policy or Elizabeth Warren on policy, then this is because you hate poor people. You don't care enough about poor people. Those were the smoke signals that Chief Warren was sending, right? See, that's not me being racist. That's me making fun of her for being a racist by, seizing on Native American culture to pretend she's a Native American so that she could get an affirmative action position at Harvard, just to clarify. Okay. Now, all of this is not to say that there aren't legitimate character arguments in America. There can be, right? There are people in American politics who lack character, obviously. Right? Richard Spencer is indeed a racist. Louis Farrakhan is indeed an anti-Semite. Bill Clinton and Donald Trump both are not great with the ladies. Right? There are character arguments that can be made about particular people. But when it comes time to make public policy, we're going to have to get beyond the character arguments if we actually want to have a discussion. So tonight, I want to talk a little bit about some of the key issues that have been pressed on us in the American political discourse, and we'll talk about some of these arguments. We'll put aside the character attacks for just a second and talk about the arguments. So the first thing that you tend to hear on college campuses these days is, again, that intersectional white privilege argument, that if you are a member of, if you are a white person, if you're a male, particularly a white male, white straight male particularly, then this means that you are an automatic beneficiary of the American system. The system was built for you. Now, originally, it is true. White males in the United States had some pretty spectacular privileges and rights that other people in the United States were not guaranteed. Okay, this was a serious problem, and we spent 200 years abolishing that problem and fighting against that problem. To ignore the history of racial discrimination or sex discrimination in the country would be idiotic, of course. Of course black people were enslaved. Of course they suffered from Jim Crow. Of course there are still racist people in the United States. And to deny any of this is idiotic. But the real question is, what do we do about racial imbalances now? So the argument is that right now, racial disparities are due to American racism. That continuing racial disparities between white folks and black folks in the United States are due to American racism. There's a big study in the New York Times that was quoted just today, supposedly arguing that black people in the United States are inherently kept down by white privilege. Now, what was weird about that particular study is that the suggestion was that among people who are in the upper income quintile, people at the upper income level, that black males had a lower trajectory for income than white males in that bracket. But strangely enough, black females had exactly the same trajectory as white females in that trajectory. So racism apparently only applies to black males. It does not apply to black females, according to this particular study, which should give you a clue that maybe it doesn't really have to do very much with racism. Maybe there are some other factors at play, because you would assume that a racist who hates black people hates black women just as much as they hate black men. They don't make exceptions for black women. The reality is that different trajectories in American life are largely due to individual decision-making. And they are largely due to disparities in outcome driven by individual decision-making. So, for example, the study doesn't take a lot of stock into account of the fact that there's a much higher crime rate among black males, yes, even in the upper income quintile, than there is among white males. This has a major impact on income trajectory. Right? The study points out that black males who grow up in areas where there are very low rates of single motherhood, where there are more fathers present, not even in the home, just in the community, that these males in the community ensure that the gap between black males and white males closes very quickly. So the solution to that isn't an end to quote-unquote racism. The solution to that is fewer black males leaving homes after impregnating women. Right? These are things that everyone is capable of doing. There's not a white racist in the country forcing a black male to impregnate a black female and leave. Okay? It has nothing to do with racism. There are lots of terrible things that happen due to racism in the United States. This is not one of them. The same thing is true of committing crimes. People committing crimes is because people want to commit crimes. It's not because some white racist forced a black guy to commit a crime, nor is it because the evil criminal justice system is staffed with evil white cops who want to arrest people. That is just not true. Homicide statistics demonstrate. Homicide statistics are a great statistic because you know every victim of a homicide, right? It's not a question of reporting to the cops. Every victim of a homicide is reporting. They're dead. And it turns out that a wildly disproportionate number of people who commit murder in the United States are young black males. This has nothing to do with biology of young black males, obviously. This is not about race. This is about a culture of single motherhood, a culture in which young men are being brought up without any role models. And there are a bevy of studies to suggest exactly this. And the idea that the police are out there discriminating against black people, this is all white privilege. The reason more blacks than whites on average are going to jail is because of white privilege or the system or all of this nonsense. It's just not true. If racism plays any part in the criminal justice system, it plays a part in the sense that white people are not sending enough cops into the inner cities to make those places safe for investment, tax-paying, and law-abiding people. Right? That's the greatest element of racism in the criminal justice system, not the idea that police officers who are going out there and busting their ass every day to keep communities safe are randomly rounding up black people for no reason. That's just nonsense, and there's no statistical evidence to support it. It's also nonsense that black people are being shot at a wildly disproportionate rate by the police. The police are just going out and willy-nilly shooting black people like Michael Brown in Ferguson. By the way, Michael Brown in Ferguson was not shot willy-nilly by the police, right? By black witness testimony in Ferguson. Okay, police officers are 18.5 times more likely to be shot by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by the police. Harvard professor Roland Fryer, who happens to be black, in July 2016 came out with a study surveying over 1,000 police shootings and found that black suspects are shot less often than white suspects in comparable situations. And there's something else here too, and this really is where discrimination comes into play. If we're going to talk about racism and discrimination, let's get really exact, because I think that it's important to define our terms. There are 3 types of discrimination, according to Thomas Sowell. He has a brand new book out that's really worth reading called Discrimination and Disparities. It's actually out today. I read it over the weekend, and he makes a really good point. His point is that there are 3 types of discrimination. Discrimination number 1 is you discriminating among behaviors. We all do this on a daily basis, right? We make friends based on discriminating among the behaviors of our friends, right? If your friend is somebody who's likely to drive you to an airport, you're less likely to be friends with someone who's not likely to drive you to the airport. This is a good kind of discrimination. Every time you order dinner, you're discriminating on the basis of your own taste, what sort of dinner you would like. This kind of discrimination is fine. Then there is the evil kind of discrimination, right? Black people are awful, therefore I'm not going to hire a black person. Black people are terrible, therefore they should go to jail, right? This stuff is actual discrimination. Then there's something in between, okay? This is what Thomas Sowell calls discrimination 1B. Okay, discrimination 1B is when people make data-based group decisions. Okay, so here's the example he gives. To take an extreme example of discrimination 1B, for the sake of illustration, if 40% of the people in group X are alcoholics, and 1% of the people in group Y are alcoholics, an employer may well prefer to hire only people from group Y for work, where an alcoholic would not only be ineffective but dangerous. This would mean the majority of the people in group X, 60% in this case, would be denied employment even though they are not alcoholics. What matters crucially to the employer is the cost of determining which individual is or is not an alcoholic when job applicants all show up sober on the day when they're seeking employment. So in other words, you have a group of people, a bunch of them are alcoholics, you have another group of people, very few of them are alcoholics, and you run a taxi company. And you've been barred legally from doing criminal background checks on these folks or giving them breathalyzers. Who do you choose? So the basic rational person would say, I choose from the group of people who are less likely to have alcoholics. That's a form of discrimination. It is not the same as racism. Okay, because it's not saying that these people are biologically bound to be alcoholics or biologically bound to not be alcoholics. You're making a data-based group decision. Now, is that moral? Well, it's uncomfortable. It's not great. The solution to that is to lower the market barriers. In other words, to remove the regulations so that people can actually do criminal background checks. In fact, what studies have shown, there are all these idiotic laws on the books promulgated by folks on the left who have said that we can't have criminal background checks for employment because too many young black men have gone to prison. And so you'll rule them out of jobs. What employers have done in response to that is stopped hiring black people. They've stopped hiring young black men because if you can't check whether a young black man went to prison, then you're going to treat a lot of young black men like they went to prison even when they didn't. If you want a solution to this sort of soft form discrimination, what you actually need to do is treat people as individuals and allow them to have criminal background checks. Black employment, when criminal background checks are allowed, goes up, not down. Because again, when you can treat people as individuals, it's better than treating people as members of groups. This also means that if you would prefer to see a society where people are not making data-based group decisions, change the data in the group. It's been true that throughout American history, there are certain groups that have been less likely to be hired. There was a time in America where Irish need not apply, Italians need not apply, Jews need not apply, Chinese need not apply, right? This has been true throughout American history. And one of the solutions to this problem has been dropping the crime rate in particular communities so that it became economically inefficient not to hire those people. Right? There's a reason that Jews are now wildly employed and Irish are now wildly employed and Mexican Americans are well employed and Asian Americans are more employed than white people. Again, change the data and you change a lot of this group discrimination, the discrimination 1B that Thomas Sowell is talking about. Okay, so theory number 2. None of this, by the way, shows animus, right? None of this is about character. I'm not making a character argument. I'm making a specific data-based argument about how we correct some of the imbalances that currently exist in American life. Okay, here's another data-based argument. Women are not, in fact, victims in the United States. Okay, women are not victims. They're not earning 77 cents on the dollar for every dollar a man makes. This statistic is sheer nonsense. It is brought out by purely averaging what women make in the United States versus what men make in the United States without, again, treating women as individuals and men as individuals. My wife and I have 2 kids. When we had our first kid, my wife took a year off of work. When we had our second kid, my wife took another 3 months off of work. I took a week off each time. Those were different career decisions. That has an impact on earnings. Okay, this is true for a large number of women in the United States. By the way, it's great that women want to stay home more with kids than men do. That's a wonderful thing. I don't understand why we're ripping on women for wanting to stay home and raise children. That's the most important thing that you can do. I bless my wife every day for doing that. And it turns out that when women make the same decisions as men, women actually earn more than men. Here's Time.com reporting from 2010. According to a new analysis of 2,000 communities by a market research company, in 147 out of 150 of the biggest cities in the US, the median full-time salaries of young women are 8% higher than those of the guys in their peer group. This is true in virtually every major city in the United States. Women who are fresh out of college and have the same degrees as men and are working the same number of hours make more money than men do. And there's also talk about how women are discriminated against because of abortion law. The simple argument on this is that no one cares about your uterus. We only care what's inside it. You don't have a right to kill something just because it's inside your uterus. Right? That is the simple argument, and it has nothing to do with discrimination against women. It has to do with whether you consider that a human life or not inside the womb. Okay, how about talk of the campus rape epidemic, the so-called rape culture in the United States and all over the world? Okay, let's be frank about this. Men are pigs. Okay, men are. As a man, I can safely say, men are pigs. They have very aggressive sexual instincts. That said, the notion that men all across the country are indulging in rape, and that men all across the country on college campuses particularly are involving themselves in radically high rates of rape is just not true. There's no statistical evidence to this. And the idea that men all over the country are in favor of rape is insane. Okay, if you polled men on whether rapists should be castrated or killed, I promise you a majority would say yes. Right? That is my personal position, by the way. It's the worst thing you can do to a woman, maybe including murder. So, yeah, but here are the statistics for those who still care about statistics. And when people say things like 1 in 4 college women have been sexually assaulted, or 1 in 3, or 1 in 5, these statistics are coming out of self-reported survey data that are self-selected in who's returning the questionnaire, and these questionnaires actually define sexual assault as anything up to and including an unwanted touch or kiss. Okay, I'm surprised it's only 1 in 3. Okay, if it were an unwanted touch or kiss of any kind, I can't imagine it's not 100% of women who haven't experienced that, because the way that men typically find out whether a woman wants to be kissed or not is they lean in. Most men are not actually going to take out a fully authorized contract with a notary and then ask you to sign the thing before. I'm a geek. I actually did ask my wife if I could kiss her before I kissed her. But that's not most dudes. Okay. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, from 1995 to 2002, there were 6 rapes per 1,000 per year on college campuses. That rate was significantly lower than the rate in the general population for people of the same age. And for people who say, well, that's just underreporting. Right? It's just people who aren't reporting. Those are people who are actually reported to the FBI, and there are lots of people who don't report. You would have to multiply that. For every person who reported, there would have to be 40 who did not report their rape. I find that difficult to believe. Also, whenever people discuss differences between the sexes, suddenly people cry sexism. There are differences between the sexes. There are brain differences between the sexes. There are physical differences between the sexes. Every neurologist will tell you this. Every psychologist will tell you this. Every psychiatrist will tell you this. Of course, this is true. Every doctor will tell you this. One of the most idiotic things I've ever seen is this new push in medicine to have people referred to doctors by the gender of their choice. How the hell is a doctor supposed to diagnose you not knowing what your actual biological sex is? If you are having lower stomach pain, the diagnosis is very different based on whether you are a biological woman than whether you are a biological man. Men and women happen to be different, and that's a good thing. Civilization sort of rests on that distinction. Okay. Here's another theory. The poor in the United States are victimized, that the 1% are getting richer and everybody else is getting poorer. This, again, is nonsense. The 1% is a rotating cast of characters. Most people in the United States will eventually be in the top quintile of income, and many of them will drop out. Virtually everyone who's currently in the top 1% will not be in the top 1% at one point, and certainly was not in the top 1% at some point in the past. I have been not in the top 1%. I have been in the top 1%. I'm sure in the future there will be a time when I am not in the top 1% again. People move in and out of the top 1%. So when people say the top 1% is getting richer, what they mean is the people, the number of figures, right? The dollar amount that gets you into the top 1% is rising. But that doesn't mean that it's the same number of people who are in the top 1%. People are going in and out of that 1% all the time, just like people are going in and out of poverty all the time. The vast majority of people who are born in poverty do not end up in poverty in the United States. In fact, if you follow these 3 basic rules, you will not end up in permanent poverty in the United States. Only 2% of all people in the United States who have followed these 3 basic rules ended up in permanent poverty, according to the Brookings Institution. Don't have kids before you get married, finish high school, get a job. That's it. You do those 3 things in the United States, you will not end up in permanent poverty, and you are all capable of these basic things. First of all, you're in college, so congratulations. You already finished high school. Okay, you can all get a job even if you're poli-sci majors. I know I was one once. And you are also fully capable of not getting someone pregnant and then taking off, or getting pregnant without wanting to. Just don't have sex without that thing on that other thing. Come on, guys. As to the notion the rich are not paying their fair share, this too is nonsense. The United States has one of the most progressive tax systems on all of planet Earth. The highest income quintile is financing 96% of the entire system of transfer payments to the bottom 60% and funding the operation of the federal government, according to the American Enterprise Institute. Okay, now for the most controversial argument I'm going to make tonight. There are differences between men and men cannot magically become women, nor can women magically become men. Okay, and this is not an animus-based argument. This is a biology-based argument. There are two sexes. There are not three. There are not five. There are not seven. There are not unicorns in a tree. There are two sexes. People with a Y chromosome are typically male. People without a Y chromosome are typically female. Variation does exist in a tiny percentage of the population. These people are called intersex and may have primary or secondary sexual characteristics that do not match the presence of the Y chromosome. Now, the argument being made by transgender advocates is not that intersex people exist. If so, if that were their argument, we would have no argument. I agree. Of course this is true. This has been true forever. The Babylonian Talmud, which was written 2,000 years ago, explicitly talks about people who are androgynos, right, in the Aramaic. Okay, it specifically talks about people who are hermaphroditic. Okay, this has been known forever. Okay, there's no controversy about this. Where there is controversy is the central claim of the transgender rights movement, which is that I, a man, a fully biological man, can proclaim myself a woman tonight, and you must all now deem me a woman. Okay, that is the argument that is being made by transgender advocates. I need not have hormone replacement therapy. I need not wear a dress. I need not change my name. If I identify as a woman, I am therefore a woman. This is asinine. This is ridiculous. This is anti-factual. Now, to be more clear, the argument is being made that gender is separate from sex. So what the left likes to do, what transgender rights arguers like to do, is they like to say, well, sure, there are only two sexes, but there are many genders. There are 59, in fact. If you go on Facebook, you will see that you can be an attack helicopter. You can be anything you want, right? Anything you want to be, you can be. There are tons of different types of gender. Okay, so in order for this argument to make sense, you have to define gender. If by gender, all you mean is you have feminine or masculine characteristics, or you like more feminine or masculine things, you have to run up against two serious problems. One serious problem is the feminist movement, which suggests that all these are social constructs and there is no such thing as feminine or masculine. Right? So feminists are going to have to answer to transgender advocates why gender even exists. Right? According to feminists, it really shouldn't, because girls can play with trucks and be just girls, and boys can play with boys can play with dresses and be just boys. Right? Because there's no such thing as feminine and masculine. These things are societal creations. They're social constructs. So either gender is a social construct or it is not. You can't have it both ways. Beyond that, the argument that you identify as your gender but not as your sex is not actually the argument being made, because the argument being made is I now have to treat you as a member of the opposite sex, not that I can just say that you're an effeminate man, for example, or a masculine woman. Right? If you want to argue that there are women who are more masculine than other women, of course that's true, and that there are men who are more effeminate than other men, of course that's true. But it's apparently offensive to say that some men are more effeminate, but it's not offensive to say that that's a woman in a man's body for some odd reason. Okay. A biological man can have feminine characteristics. A biological female can have male characteristics, right? All of this is true. But that does not mean that gender is completely disconnected from sex, because that's just silly. As for the notion that children, you can tell at age 2 or 3, the best thing to do is if your 2-year-old comes to you and says, "Mommy, I'm a boy," and it's actually a girl, that you actually should say to your kid, "You know what, darling, let's start your gender transition now. This is stupidity." Virtually all kids, at least 80% of children who say they are transgender when they are young, grow out of transgenderism by the time they reach sexual maturity. Okay, as far as the efficacy of transgender surgery, I really don't care one way or another. Once you're an adult, do whatever the hell you want. It's a free country. It doesn't matter to me. But the evidence is at best mixed. Okay, the idea that if society just would, the argument made in favor of these asinine arguments in the end is a utilitarian one. Well, if we just say to all these people who are suffering from a delusion, right, that they are a member of the opposite sex, that they, sex opposite to what they are, if they suffer from this delusion, the kind thing we should do as a society is say, okay, you're actually a member of that opposite sex, and then you can get surgery and everything will be all better. The data just isn't there to support that. Okay, it just isn't there to support that. The suicide rate among people who are post-op transgenders remains significantly higher than comparable people in the general population who have never had that surgery and are not transgender. The level of bullying of transgenders is extraordinarily high, which is awful, but there's not really solid evidence to actually connect that with level of suicidality, according to a number of different studies. In fact, there's a study from the UCLA School of Law, Williams Institute, and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, which was a study of studies, actually. And what they found is that 46% of transgender men and 42% of transgender women attempt suicide over the course of their lives. And the suicidality rate among transgender women who say people identify them as transgender regularly is 45%. Right? So that would go to the idea that if people identify you as the gender, as the biological sex you actually are, that this means that you're suicidal, except for the fact that 40% of people who say they are never identified as transgender still say they have tried suicide in their lives. So the suicidality rate is unfortunately extremely high because suicidality and transgenderism are highly comorbid. Okay, all of which is to say you can't change the entire definition of societal sex based on what is pretty obviously a mental disorder and was up until 3 years ago or 5 years ago in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual considered a mental disorder. And for no obvious evidentiary reason, it was shifted mainly for political reasons. Okay, all of this is to suggest that there are arguments that can be made. Okay, so I'm happy to hear those arguments next, right? We'll do a Q&A, and people who can argue, who want to argue, go to the front. But none of this has to do with you're a bad person. Now, that won't be the argument made after the speech. The argument after the speech will be Shapiro hates transgender, Shapiro hates blacks, Shapiro hates women. All of this is nonsense. Nothing I have said anywhere in here either has an ounce of animus or is intended to generate an ounce of animus. Right? We're all trying to solve problems together in American society. That means looking at the facts ourselves. It means looking at the facts and having discussions about them. If we can't do that, it's not even worth us talking. We may as well appoint some sort of oligarchic clique to govern us. If we're going to govern ourselves, we're going to have discussions with one another, and that means getting past the central point that we are not all evil. We're actually brethren in arms. We live in the freest, most prosperous country in the history of the world. The only way it's going to stay that way is if we recognize that we're brothers and not enemies. Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions. So as I say, the rule is that hands up and you go to the front of the line if you disagree.
Hello, everyone. We ask that you don't ramble and make your questions short and sweet. Please ask one question and keep the discussion civil. Thank you for coming tonight, everyone.
Well, glad I answered all your life questions, guys. We can do anything. It doesn't have to be on the topic of the speech. I'll even do dating advice, although you have been warned.
Hi. I have an environmental class in my high school. We just got done with our global warming unit, and we were talking about the alternative energy sources. And I was always asking my teacher, if we did go over to mostly renewable sources, what would the economic effect have on it? What would be your opinion on that?
Well, obviously, we have a carbon-based economy. Oil is extraordinarily efficient. Natural gas is extraordinarily efficient. Coal is relatively efficient. All of these are more efficient than solar and wind power. And so if by totally renewable energy we're talking about solar and wind, those technologies are simply not ready for the road. You can have Teslas that are based on electricity, and those seem like those are getting close to market, but they're also really, really expensive, and they run out of power after about 300 miles or so. All of that said, would I like to see movement toward renewable energy? Sure. I mean, I think everybody would. It pollutes less. You don't have to worry as much about the environmental consequences. But, I mean, estimates show that if you were to immediately outlaw, for example, all gas, you would cripple the economy. The economy would be done. I mean, we'd be a third world country virtually overnight if you were to do that. So you can't do it that way. Fortunately, we have this mechanism called the economy in which efficient methods of energy generate higher profits. And that's why you're seeing a movement toward more efficient fuel models. And this has been true in cars since the 1970s. Right, lighter, more fuel-efficient cars have been dominating the road recently. As oil prices rise, that's going to be truer and truer, and the environment is getting better. Now, I'm not somebody who's against all environmental regulation, by the way, because I believe that things that generate externalities can be regulated. But I do think that we have to take into account whether the effectiveness of a particular regulation is going to be useful or whether it's just a way for us to make ourselves feel better. And I think we have to look at that on a regulation-by-regulation basis.
Thank you. And I was just wondering if you'd be able to sign my book for me real quick.
Come on over to the front of the stage and I'll do it for you.
If you were to become president or an advisor to the president, what would you do to lower or reduce the national debt?
Well, so those are two different questions. If I were president, the first thing that I would do is eliminate a bevy of departments on the federal level. I'd get rid of the Department of Education. I would get rid of the Department of Energy. I would get rid of the EPA. I think all of these things can be fulfilled by actual legislation, right? The big problem is that you have enormous bureaucracies that employ literally millions of people and that cost an enormous amount of money, and Congress right now has an incentive to kick all the lawmaking power over to the regulatory bodies, and those regulatory bodies have no incentive not to spend enormous amounts of public money. The reality is, though, that cutting those departments won't make a difference. The first thing you have to do is privatize Social Security and restructure Medicare and Medicaid. Right? Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid represent 66% of the federal budget every year. They are the main drivers of America's national debt. And so anything else is just trimming around the edges. When we talk about cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, it ain't going to do it. There just isn't enough waste, fraud, and abuse to fill in that gap. So, by the way, Social Security, I mean, that's something everybody in this room should be for, restructuring of Social Security. You guys aren't seeing a buck. Okay, I'm not seeing a buck either. I'm never seeing that money again. That money is down a rat hole. Okay, you're paying that money in, it ain't coming out. The only way you're ever going to get that money back is if we have a system whereby we guarantee the Social Security payments of everybody, say, above the age of 55, but we start to transition people on an age-rolling basis toward privatization, guaranteeing a percentage of Social Security, plus you can now pay less tax and put your money into the stock market, for example, invest your own money. That's the only way that you're going to cure that problem. And Medicaid and Medicare seem to me should be done on a state basis, not on a federal basis. I'm not sure why the federal government is involved in those programs to begin with. These are not in the purview of the Constitution of the United States. If I were an advisor to the president, the first thing I would tell him is, Mr. President, put down that phone.
Quick follow-up, would you consider cutting defense spending at all?
So the answer is yes, but it depends on line by line. I'd actually have to go through the defense, but I'm not one of these people who thinks that we need golden toilets, in the Department of Defense. But that said, defense is a legitimate function of the federal government. I think that there are a lot of functions the federal government is currently performing that are certainly not within its constitutional purview.
Thank you.
Hi, Ben. My name's Mary, and I'm a huge fan.
Thank you.
My question concerns my future career choices. I hope to study political science and history, get a doctorate degree, and teach at a university. But I'm scared that being a conservative will make me a target. And do you have any advice to help me be successful in that career?
Yes. So my friend Dennis Prager and I have two very different views on this. My view is that you as an individual have to make a decision about how successful you want to be in that career and how long you can wait to actually say what you think. Because there's no question that if you were to write a historical paper on the fascist roots of gun control, that this would be very difficult to get by a PhD advisor for a dissertation. So you are going to have to wade through an enormous amount of manure in order to get to the roses. And by the way, I don't soft pedal that. I don't. There are a lot of people who will say, well, you should just stand up and say what you think anyway. Yeah, except then they shut down your career. Nobody ever hears about it, and you spend the rest of your life wondering what if. So my view is that you should say exactly what professors want you to say until you get their degree, and then you should become rich and famous and then say what you want. This was my actual strategy at UCLA. When I went to UCLA undergrad, when I was there, I wrote in Blue Books. Blue Books, I don't know if you guys still have Blue Books. You write anonymously in your Blue Books? Yes. Okay, so Blue Books are the greatest things that ever were because they can't tell who's writing them. So I would mouth off as much as possible in class, and then in my Blue Books I'd write like Bernie Sanders, and that's how you graduate summa cum laude from UCLA in political science. And then that gets you into Harvard Law School, and now they can't say you're stupid because you went to all their top institutions. So it's a method that I highly recommend.
Thank you so much.
I have a question about Edward Snowden. and the NSA. In your opinion, was he a hero or a traitor, and why?
So he is a traitor who also revealed valuable information to the public. Both things can be true at once. So he's a traitor in that he was pretty obviously working as an agent of the Russian government. I mean, he ended up fleeing to Russia and hanging out there, and being sponsored by the Russian government in a lot of this stuff. That said, is it important that the American people know that the federal government is gathering massive amounts of metadata? Sure. I just think that he went about it all wrong. If you want to leak it to the American press, you leak it to the American press, and then you take the consequences of that. But he didn't, right? He fled to Russia, and he decided to stay there, and he decided to release all of this information in bulk rather than even bothering to redact the portions that were most harmful to national security, which isn't the mark of a really responsible actor. So am I glad that we know more about the PRISM system? Yes, I'm very glad we know more about the PRISM system. Is that something we should have known more about before, the misuses of the Patriot Act surveillance system? Absolutely. Is he also somebody who I would trust with America's national security? Absolutely not.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here with us this evening. I hope you're enjoying your time on our campus. I want to take on the transgender issue, of course, because it's got to be treated. So one of the helpful distinctions you've made is how you differentiate public and private responses to individuals who are transgender. And you talked about that this evening briefly when you talk about people who publicly demand that they be referred to by a certain name or certain pronoun. My question is about the private context. And I've seen you allude to this a little, but I'm curious what your take is on this. If you and I were next door neighbors and I came by and said that while a biological man, I'm going to now be living as a woman, and I'm going to use a female name, and I'm going to live as a woman, and just telling you this as your next door neighbor and as your friend, that's a different context. And so I'm curious, what do you think is the appropriate way as you and I as private individuals to interact in that sort of situation?
So I think that whatever would reduce friction as neighbors would probably be useful. So number one, I am not, so I've always said that I am happy to use people's preferred name, but not pronoun. And that goes for public as well as private. So meaning, here's the good news about the English language. If you and I are speaking, I get to address you in second person, which is exactly the same whether you're male or female. So it really is not an issue. If you wish to call yourself, Bertha, then I will call you Bertha because you can change your name in the United States, right? That's something you can do, and names are names. That is not an objective statement about your biology. If, however, you wish me to refer to you as a woman, which presumably would be to a third party or something, that's something that I'm not willing to do, unless it were just, if it were the two of us privately, for example, and we were just having dinner together, and you want to be called that, for the sake of avoiding conflict, I probably would do that. But if we're, as you say, if we're talking in public and we're talking about the general public policy issue of whether this is something that all of American society ought to embrace, the idea that you're a woman, there's a difference between me humoring you for the sake of good conversation and me actually believing things, right? Friends routinely elide facts about one another. And this would be another one of those cases if you and I lived next door to each other, I think.
Thank you.
You said you believe that after age 18, an individual can decide whatever they want to do with their body in reference to transgenders. Do you also believe that individuals should be able to commit self-harm and or suicide without being institutionalized? If not, then how are they different?
Okay, so the question of institutionalization is whether you are capable of even living a particular life and whether you're in control of yourself. So this is actually it's actually a fantastic question. What I would say is that the evidence that you are reducing your likelihood to live through transgender surgery is nil. Right? I don't see any evidence that the rates of suicide go up after transgender surgery. What I do see is that the rate of suicide goes up after suicide, or after suicide attempts. So your rates of death do go up after that. So if we as a society have an obligation to prevent you from self-harm, one of the things that's not clear is whether transgender surgery is actually self-harm or not. Right? The data on that it's actually relatively mixed because it doesn't seem to have much of an impact either way with regard to suicidality. And whether I consider it self-harm or not, if you're not actively killing yourself, I'm not sure that I put it in the same basket as, anything else. I think that, from personal perspective, I think tattoos are self-harm, right? I wouldn't tattoo myself. I wouldn't have my kids get a tattoo. But I think there are plenty of things in American life we're allowed to do that are not actually reducing your likelihood to live. Transgender surgery, I think, falls closer to that category in my personal political philosophy than it does to suicide.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Announcing yourself with authority. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So some of my family members have started going through the process of applying to colleges and actually moving in to colleges. So in my mindset, without being overbearing, how would I help them avoid some of this far left or far right rhetoric?
So, I mean, I think that if you're looking for sources of information, then I have a reading list that I've been working on for the last 2.5 years, basically, on my podcast, where I recommend something every single day. But what I would say is that you have to address it issue by issue. So most people are not interested in reading giant philosophical canon works by Plato, Aristotle, any of this. What they are interested in are quick answers. And fortunately, there are a lot of resources for that. So if they're discussing an issue, then it's a high likelihood you're going to be able to find a good video on it from Prager University or from me or from Jordan Peterson or from Sam Harris, who's not even right-wing, but I think is an interesting thinker. There's a bevy of material you can find online. All I would recommend is that you keep it short and sweet because you have to balance out the efficacy of the information with the amount of information contained, right? You can't send somebody an hour-long lecture about global warming when all they want is a 5-minute answer.
Right. Could I get a book signed too?
Sure, come on. Yeah. Yeah, go for it.
Test. Hi, Mr. Shapiro.
Howdy.
I'm actually the president of the College Democrats here.
Well, thank you for coming and thank you for co-sponsoring. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.
Now, quick question. Are you the guy who protested me outside, or are you the guy?
We were having a bake sale, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's...
Well, were the cookies good at least?
Yeah, great
okay, good.
cookies.
Fantastic. Were they legal?
Not yet. Give it time. So my question to you relates specifically to the transgender issue that you brought up during your speech. You cite the UCLA study and claim that it doesn't show in any way that suicide rates go down post-out. You say there's no evidence verifying this. However, during your speech...
I said there's mixed evidence. I said there's mixed evidence about the drop in suicide rate.
During your speech, I pulled up the study on my phone as well as a bevy of other studies. Looking at research from the Karolinski Institute, from Berlin scientists, it actually seems to suggest, specifically the Berlin study, that suicide attempt rates dropped from 26% to 3% in post-op treatment.
Right, so I've seen that study also. One of the problems with that particular study is it's not longitudinal. That study is only about 1 year after the surgery. And what the statistics tend to show, at least according to scientists on the other side, right, is that you have to wait 10 years to find out whether the surgery takes or not, essentially. That there is an adjustment period, that of course you're really enthused in the year after you get a surgery that you feel you've been needing your entire life, but there's a readjustment period that happens. So for example, here's another longitudinal study. This is a cohort study from Sweden. It was released in 2011 and covered sex reassignment surgeries from 1973 to 2003. So it's a 30-year longitudinal study, and it found that transgender surgery recipients were still 19 times more likely to die by suicide than the general population, and found that, quote, sex reassignment, although alleviating gender dysphoria, may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism. Right, so as I say, there is mixed data. I'm not saying those studies don't exist. I'm saying I do find severe flaws in some of the studies that are cited. A lot of them are cited due to small sample size or not enough time in the longitudinal. Yeah, you can follow up. That's fine.
Thank you. But specifically regarding the UCLA study, it actually suggests that when people are in supportive environments, their suicide attempt rates go down. You said that you do not believe feeding into their, quote, delusion will support them. How do you respond to the UCLA study you yourself use, suggesting that it in fact does?
So a lot of these, I don't tend to believe self-reported studies about treatment, meaning how people treat you. Questionnaire studies are not as good as behavioral studies. So the more important statistic from that study, the one that I usually cite, is the one about whether people can identify you as transsexual or as transgender or not. Right? If they can identify you as transgender, it's a 45% lifetime suicidality, suicide attempt rate. And if you are not identified as transgender, there's a 40% lifetime suicide attempt rate. Now, that doesn't mean that if people are mean to you, that your life isn't worse or that your suicide rate may not go up. Maybe it does, but I think that the evidence is not particularly strong on that score. And the level of bullying you have to really have some sort of third-party documentation as to the level of bullying, because there's also the significant possibility that people who are more likely to commit suicide are also more likely to feel sensitive to bullying that other people might not feel sensitive to.
Thank you for coming out. I hope you enjoy the weather.
Mr. Shapiro, given the recent Andrew McCabe firing and the FBI investigations in general, do we have, as the president seems to imply, an out-of-control FBI, bureaucratic mismanagement, Washington is normal, or a president that can't seem to leave well enough alone?
All of the above might be a possibility. I think that the short story is that government is filled with people. People suck. Okay, that's the really short story. And that means that there are some politically driven people, and there are some honest people, and there are some politically driven people who believe they're honest. And so, do I think there was a giant conspiracy afoot inside the FBI to delegitimize the president in the run-up to the election? No. I don't think that. The reason I don't think that is because it makes no sense. Because again, the initial investigation began in March 2016, not with the Carter Page FISA warrant, but with the investigation into George Papadopoulos. And also, I was there during the election cycle, and the FBI didn't leak all the information on the Trump investigation, but they were routinely discussing the Hillary investigation. So it's been amusing to watch as James Comey went from being a hero to Hillary fans, to being a villain to Hillary fans, back to being a hero to Hillary fans. Right? He's literally done that in a year and a half. It's pretty incredible. As far as Andrew McCabe, what I don't understand is how McCabe being fired has anything to do with, for example, the Mueller investigation. Now, let me be clear. I don't think there was any Trump-Russia collusion, because I don't think Trump could collude with his right foot. I just don't think it's possible. Right? In order for Trump to be able to collude with things, he has to know what's going on around him. And I don't think that the president is well known for his organizational prowess, as you may have noticed in his staffing decisions of late. Right? This is not somebody who's sitting in the back room playing MAGA, MAGA, MAGA 4D underwater, upside down, hungry, hungry hippos. Right? This is a guy who's flying by the seat of his pants, which, is his thing. But the suggestion, I know people who are in his campaign. In fact, I know the people who ran his campaign. And it was a shit show. I'm not going to, pardon the language, but the notion that they were organizing this every step of the way, and it was deep cover. They had some sort of a drop zone where they would drop documents for the Russians, and Putin would stop by with his documents and drop them back, and it was all Hillary's emails, and then they'd reveal them in the most organized possible fashion. In the middle of that election cycle, the president of the United States was caught on tape saying he wanted to grab women by their genitals. Okay, that's not how this campaign went. Okay, so again, I think Trump's his defense to this is very easy. Of course I didn't do this. Have you seen me? Right? Unfortunately, I think that he's so wrapped up in all of the hullabaloo about it that he's, I think, rightly angry and frustrated that he won't be cleared. Because I do think that there is, once you start a special counsel investigation, it goes all the way to the end. And what you're seeing from Trump right now can be read in one of two ways. If I were on the left, I would read this as Trump is obviously guilty of something and trying to cover it up. If I were on the right, which I am, I'd read this as Trump doesn't know what the hell he's doing and he's pissed and he's saying crap. Because that fits the profile more to me, right? He's pissed off and he's saying crap. In fact, that may go on his headstone, right? Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States, he was pissed off and saying crap. And so, yeah, as far as the McCabe thing, do I think Mueller should be fired? No, I think Mueller should go ahead. I think we'll find out what Mueller has to say. I think in all likelihood it'll be weak tea, and then at the end, everybody will go back home and whine about it.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Shapiro, my question is directed towards the topic of gun rights and gun control. And with all the recent shootings and school shootings where most of the shooters were able to easily acquire a gun and ammunition in a gun store, I was just, as a fellow conservative and supporter of the Second Amendment, I'm just curious to know, do you believe that rather than outlying certain like assault rifles or bump stocks, do you believe there should be more of enforcement of background checks and psychological exams to reduce probability of these people acquiring weapons, or you still believe there should be very few restrictions?
Well, I mean, there are universal background checks for all legally purchased firearms that are not hand-to-hand transfers in the United States, right? I mean, that is the federal law. If you buy from a federally licensed firearms dealer, you are going through a federal background check. The problem in the case of Parkland is that there were 1 million warnings about this guy, and the authorities did nothing. So this was not a lack of authority on the part of the authorities. This was a lack of performance on the part of the authorities. You saw the same thing in the Sutherland Springs shooting. You saw the same thing in Sandy Hook. You saw the same thing at Virginia Tech. There have been just a bevy of warnings about an enormous number of these folks, and the authorities didn't do what they were supposed to do, or the gun was obtained illegally, or if it was obtained legally, there's really no way to take a gun away from some of these folks, like the Las Vegas shooter. There's no real way to prevent him from buying guns without preventing 300 million Americans from buying guns. He didn't have a criminal record. There was no psychiatric history. So we still don't, I mean, it's amazing that we've just glossed right over the worst shooting in American history, and we still don't know what went on. I'm deeply suspicious that there was stuff going on there that we don't know about. The police department has not been forthcoming there. But again, the question is, how do you do this in terms of public policy? Do I think more background checks are going to make a difference? Not really. We have universal background checks in the state of California. It hasn't seemed to make much of a difference in the murder rate or in gun crime in the state of California. We've had mass shootings in the state of California, multiple in the last several years. The San Bernardino shooting happened just a couple of years ago. So do I think that banning particular types of weapons is going to matter? I don't think that banning AR-15s is going to matter. I think that an AR-15 is just a rifle. It's a semi-automatic rifle. People who pretend the AR-15 is different in kind from other rifles doesn't know anything about a semi-automatic rifle. It is a normal semi-automatic rifle. This is bump stocks. Bump stocks could be seen as a slightly different thing. Machine guns have been illegal in the United States essentially since 1934, reiterated in 1987. They've been in short supply ever since. The problem with banning bump stocks is, again, I'm not sure how effective that's going to be, considering that you can essentially manufacture a bump stock with a spring and some plastic. But that said, there's a stronger case to ban bump stocks through regulation than there is to ban AR-15s. I don't see any legal case under the Second Amendment for banning AR-15s.
Okay, well, thank you.
This will be our last question due to time constraints.
Hey, Ben. Well, I was going to tell you about my friends over at Birch Gold, but they asked me to keep it short, so I am going to ask. In one of our classes recently, I'm a political science major, we were talking about legal realism and the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, and I had a question. As someone who does believe, who tends to believe a little more on the legal realistic side, how much legitimacy do you think we should present to the Supreme Court, given the fact that they're unelected officials who serve lifetime appointments and appear to be political actors at this point?
I mean, my answer is very little. I've never been a big fan of judicial review. In fact, I wrote my entire third-year thesis at Harvard Law School on why judicial review was never fully intended by the framers of the Constitution. So I've never been a believer that there should be this group of wise men who sit and women who sit at the upper level wearing black robes that make them special, declaring what is and is not constitutional. I think that every constitutional office in the United States requires you to swear an oath to uphold the Constitution, and virtually every question is a political question, doctrine question, meaning that the branches should basically slug it out with each other. I tend to be more of a legal realist as well. I think that legal realism, for people who don't know, is a basic philosophy that says that people tend to rule along the lines of their political preferences and then make up excuses afterward, which, again, I think is more true of people on the left of the court than on the right, but maybe that's because I'm on the right? I mean, the reason that I believe that is because there are more cases where Justice Scalia would have voted in favor of upholding a law that he personally disagreed with than cases where people on the left wing of the court vote in favor of upholding a law they disagree with. Right? If Anthony Kennedy doesn't like a law, down it goes. If Scalia doesn't like a law, the question he asks himself is, does the legislature have the authority to make that law in the first place? So I'm not a full legal realist because I do think it's possible to interpret the Constitution properly, but I am sympathetic to the argument of legal realists insofar as it results in a centralization of power in one branch of the government above and beyond the other two branches of the American government, which I feel is more aristocratic and oligarchic than the founders intended.
Thank you. And if you ever fire Mathis, you can expect to see my resume on your desk.
I appreciate it. Well, thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it.